Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
All right, is it
You're audible.
clear, the voice?
Yeah. You're audible very
All right,
clearly.
okay. Before I begin, I must tell you that I am using a desktop. So there are chances, although usually it's rare, but there are chances that there might be a, power cut. And in that situation, I might shift to my phone. I don't find it very comfortable, but in that situation, I will shift to my phone. And for that 2 or 3 minutes of, that period of change, you have to bear. So this is, thanks for inviting me in the HCU fraternity movement. I believe it is, uh, well, as of now, we haven't had a chance to physically interact much, but I believe it is an active group of students concerned about things in and around us and responding to it through their own academic political training and a variety of perspectives. At the onset, I would like to, at the beginning itself, I'd like to, pay my, concern as well as my solidarity with all those who are incarcerated under arrest, braving the might of the state after having led, participated, and given shape to this remarkable, unprecedented, historical kind of a movement which mobilized and galvanized large sections of the Indian population, particularly the minorities. I extend my message of my solidarity with them. It is, of course, whatever be the kind of charges which have been leveled against them, in my understanding and comprehension, they are essentially political prisoners being, you know, being, facing the, they're facing the retributory practices of the state for having questioned, raised their voice, and not allowed, uh, an act which was so atrocious to so far. I'm not allowed an act which is so atrocious, so discriminatory. I'm talking about the Citizenship Amendment Act, and prior to that, the NRC, which was conducted in Assam. And the protesters have raised their voice and vociferously, and as a result, at least the the passing of the law did not go uncontested. It was largely, it had a very smooth sail in the parliament when many political parties, although the majority party, the BJP, brought in the bill, but many political parties also came out in support. Some remained silent, but on the streets we saw that how powerfully it was opposed. So this is also an occasion. I believe that this is almost more than a year of anti-CAA protests, and many of our fellow comrades are today in facing today in jails. We've seen how during the last few years, how many of the institutions leave aside the law enforcing agencies. But apart from that, those which are meant to mete out justice too have fallen. And as a result, there continuous denial of bail, continuous postponement of dates, and for no rhyme or reason, people continue to be behind the bars. This, of course, this talk, this discussion is largely around the anti-CAA protests. And in my understanding, as I said, that this protest in itself was historical and remarkable in the sense that it brought in the kinds of people, ordinary people, out into the protest meetings. You know, they were playing variety of roles there in their own capacities, with you know, immense imagination, innovativeness as well. So we could see a range of activities which included students, which included, you know, seasoned activists, but also included a large number of people who probably had never ever earlier participated in protests. Women, ordinary women who probably never imagined themselves in a political role, uh, were playing leadership roles in many places. Shaheen Bagh was not just one. Shaheen Bagh was an inspiration which, in a small nook and corner of this country, we found people coming out and sitting on sit-ins and dharnas, and in their own different ways, protests were designed. Uh, the amount of participation in this protest is again very difficult to actually assess, but one could see that the way in which uh, almost every part of the country, small towns to big cities, even villages, were sites of protest, uh, which only shows that the extent to which the Citizenship Amendment Act was seen as a draconian law by the people who felt that the laws were directly, in some ways or the other, attacking their very existence, their very citizenship claim itself, uh, their quest to, you know, achieve substantive citizenship in this country. They felt through this Citizenship Amendment Act, and prior to that, the National, you know, Registration of Citizenship, the NRC, uh, was meant to essentially, you know, exclude them from the idea of being a right-bearing citizen in this country. And hence, we saw people rising in huge numbers and coming out in almost everywhere. Uh, my discussion here is about how the state responds to different kinds of protests. In the eyes of the state, then, although the Constitution uh, as a document assures equality of citizenship, the idea of citizen is a universal idea. And yet, we find that in various different experiences of the way in which the state relates with sections of populations, and this is more out in the open in situations like this, when protests and resistance emerge, that we see how this idea of a universal citizen with equal rights and therefore an equal kind of or a similar kind of a you know, engagement with the state and the citizen, uh, uh, we find goes missing. And this was very evident in the case of the anti-CAA protests, and which I would like to highlight during this talk. Many of you would be familiar with, those who have been participant in these protests or keen observers of these protests would know that how the state came out with all its might, both the legal as well as extra legal forces in the command of the state. The stormtroopers as well were recruited to punish the protesters for having gathered the courage, quote unquote, gathered the courage to raise their voice. Uh, So here I am reminded when I'm talking about citizenship and its universality, etc. Uh, I'm reminded of one of the instances in history through which Partha Chatterjee approaches this question. In Partha Chatterjee's book, The Politics of the Governed, in the early chapters itself, Chatterjee raises this question about to what extent is this idea of citizen, not mediated by class, caste, gender, race, religion considerations. And he gives the example of how the French Declaration of Rights, which is seen as a historic moment in the emergence of the idea of universal citizen, which is idealized by constitutions across the world. And there, uh, as the Universal Declaration of Rights of French people in post-revolutionary France took place, this also captured the imagination of people, particularly subjugated people in different parts of the world. It captured the imagination of the Haitian revolutionaries. Haiti was then sort of a colony of France, who too declared their independence, who too argued that they were also free citizens. And this declared that they also got inspiration from the French Declaration of Rights of Man. But immediately France sent forces, curbed it through deception, captured its leader, and who finally died in custody. They were told, the Haitians, that this equality of citizenship is not applied to them because they are not free. It is only for those who are free. So, therefore, Chatterjee concludes from this that this whole idea about the universal citizenship has its beginning itself, leave aside its presence, the beginning itself marred with uh, deep, suspicions and doubts about its universality, about its idea of equality itself. It would apply differently to people depending on to what race, religion, gender, an Indian context, caste, or class people would belong to. Uh, this character of the state and its approach towards the citizens uh, might be noticed and has been noticed in a variety of situations. But what I could also observe was how the relationship between state and civil society comes to work. The relationship between state and civil society, by which I here mean associations of people which have emerged in various democracies. Those who are students of political science would know how Tocqueville in Democracy in America would argue that a democracy in America actually rested and was strengthened because of the presence of civil societies. So civil societies were those non-state associational forms where citizenship groups were formed in order to ensure that the rights which the citizens enjoyed through constitutional democracies were protected. But at the same time, the civil society in its associational form would also work within the framework of a constitutional order, where it is expected to, where the state and civil society relationship is, whether recognize it or not, but if you see the layers within in this relationship is extremely regimented as well, extremely controlled as well. In this discussion, I would also like to bring that out. Not only this, how the state and the citizen relationship is, has various different layers depending on who the citizen is and how the state responds to it. but also the way in which the state relates with civil society. Uh, and again, uh, what kind of a civil society are we talking about? Uh, in the anti-CAA protests, let us, you know, without any doubt, let me say that the Citizenship, Amendment Act, with all its discriminatory provisions, and which was adopted by the Parliament in virtually no time in 2019, in its form as well as in intention, is comparable. In fact, it draws inspiration from the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany, or the laws of return that Israel, as a Zionist state, came to adopt. The Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany ensured or were aimed at excluding the Jews as well as the Romas, and similarly many others whom the fascist regime felt as the Germans. So laws of marriage, laws of who would enjoy full citizenship, etc., uh, came within the new rubric of Nuremberg laws. Return to Israel and claim Israeli citizenship. Now, this is exactly what the the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, aims at. Irrespective of the fact that whether you're born in India or not, it extends the provision of citizenship on the basis of uh, what religion or faith one belongs to, and it thus consciously excludes the Muslims, or particularly the Muslim, immigrants, who could also lay claim or apply or would like to adopt the India as a homeland. So the property of religion is included, which otherwise did not exist in the Indian idea of citizenship. So faith, in some ways or the other, made an entry in the statute books. Uh, and the Citizenship Amendment Act dispatched a clear message that blood and belongingness will be a determinant of Indian nationality. Uh, it would be based on who, whether you belong to an Indian quote unquote Indic faith or a foreign faith. Although he belatedly added Parsis and Christians too, but what this was largely to to keep off the criticism. Unmistakably, it targeted Muslims alone. Uh, in the if you go back to the uh, uh, what would we can call the doctrines of Hindutva, the textbook Hindutva, where a clear distinction is made between faiths which are of Indic and which are of non-Indic origins. Those which are considered to be of non-Indic are not necessarily equal citizens. The CAA seems to be inspired from a similar idea. But another distinction has remained within the Hindutva textbook, which, particularly in the context of Assam, has been used to communalize the society and to communalize the anti-foreigner movement in Assam. This is to maintain a distinction between the immigrant and the infiltrator. The immigrant is someone who, for maybe because of persecution or a variety of reasons, comes to India, adopts India as a homeland. But infiltrator is person with an ill intention. But this is not based, the immigrant and infiltrator is not based on the individual's intentionality, but is based on the faith to which the individual belongs, the refuge seeker belongs. One of the questions which, I gave the example of Germany, Nazi Germany. One of the questions which Hannah Arendt, in her work, particularly the Eichmann in Jerusalem, banality of evil. Arendt, is actually completely perplexed by the fact that the Jews were in hordes, were attacked, killed, and were put into concentration camps. But there was probably no protest. They more or less willingly succumbed and surrendered. Arendt actually, sees the aggressiveness of the Israeli state, and with a certain kind of astonishment, compares it with the submissiveness of the Jews or the meekness when it came to them being targeted, and how virtually there was no resistance from amongst the Jews. Arendt actually quotes David Rosset, who was one of the inhabitants in a camp, one of the inmates in a camp, and who said that the triumph of the the triumph of the fascist, securities, the SS, their triumph was in the fact that the tortured victim allowed himself to be led to the noose without protesting. That he renounced and abandoned himself to the point of ceasing to affirm his identity itself. Arendt would recount how the Jews many times arrived on time whenever they were supposed to be taken to concentration camps in trains, etc. They would arrive on time, walk on their own feet to the places of execution, dug their own graves, would lie side by side to be shot. Now, probably the fear of the enemy or the fear of the oppressor had, was instilled so much that it only led to, obedience. In contrast, now 40, nearly 70, 80 years later, when a similar program is being attempted at in India, and those who drew inspiration from the fascist state and its mechanisms, which I've already said, in many ways, they, you know, eh, draw inspiration, imitate, emulate, draw emulation from there. So 80 years down the line, it wasn't that meekness of the oppressed anymore. That what was not expected probably was the way in which the ordinary would rise. But when the ordinary individuals rise in protest, as we see even in the case of the farmers' movement today, that when it rises in protest, it may not necessarily subscribe to the regimented mechanisms of protest. It may not necessarily subscribe to and continue to be controlled by the agreed upon mechanisms, ways, sites of registering their resistance. Because the protester who is now risen is fighting for its own existence. It is no longer fighting just simply for making a certain kind of a voice to be heard, but it is fight for existence, and which then knows no bound. Despite that, the protests we know have been hugely, peaceful, although the mechanisms or the ways in which people protested in different places have differed. They varied in their forms and intensity and styles. There were long marches, sit-ins, candlelight vigils, to even reports of some places of stone pelting, etc. The agitators appeared completely undeterred by detentions, arrests, custodial torture, by ruthless lathi charge and police bullets. As I said in the beginning itself, the way in which the state targeted the anti-CAA protest was unprecedented. It entered universities, it beat up students, it entered houses, localities, in many parts of Western UP, and even up to Mangalore or many other places. The protesters were not only chased into their homes, into their localities, but they were beaten up black and blue, massive arresting, as well as police entered their houses and even houses and then picked up randomly people. And many of them continue to be behind bars today with little support from the justice and mechanism which we have. What was again, I forgot to mention the large number of people, again, which is completely unheard of, that the way they were killed in these skirmishes, particularly through police bullets. 23 or 24 is the number, but it could be more even. In recent history, we do not hear of any such kind of a vehemence with which the state responded to the protesters. Uh, and some of the times one could think about reasons why the protesters coming from, see, let me tell you that it is true that a good section of the concerned citizens of this country participated in these protests, but nevertheless the protests were largely uh, uh, constituted of everywhere, constituted largely of people from the minorities amongst the Muslims, particularly the Muslims. And therefore, the point which I raised in the beginning itself, the state-citizenship relationship and how it is comes to be one way or the other affected by also class, gender, religion, etc. And here in this case, we see that quite pronounced. The kind of atrocities which we reported from Nehtar in Bijnor, where police opened fire, killed people, and then they said it was in self-defense, or in Mangalore, where it didn't even enter the hospital. What was the source of that anger? What was the source of the reason of that kind of a deep sort of a anger against the class of population? This remains extremely difficult to comprehend. Well, these protests did not necessarily subscribe to any regimented kind of ways in which protests are handled in the country. Like, for example, we have designated spots. These designated spaces are where the citizenry is allowed to congregate and register their defiance. In Delhi, for example, you have Jantar Mantar, the Ramlila ground, if the turnout is a little more, or occasionally India Gate 2. Similar kind of, uh, designated spaces for protests have sprung up in various different cities. In these places, protesters, as much as the law enforcers, know the rules of the game here. If the anger is immense and passions high, a barricade or two could be crossed. And sometimes an occasional water cannon can also be, uh, the protesters may have to face that. And the protesters, usually part of cities' literati, the academics, celebrated civil rights activists, are generally a class above the ordinary constable, junior police officials who are tasked to manage them. There's a very clear power relations, which is very significantly altered here. State power represented by the police official is curiously constrained in such places. If we do an ethnography of such designated protest sites, we should not miss the classificatory practices that are built in the form, content, and aesthetics of protest adopted. Whether in the vocabulary of the speeches, the inventive placards that there, the kind of people who participate, the musical renditions, some kinds of poetry sessions, both the protesters and the enforcers are rarely shy of exhibiting professional efficiency. The protests generally turns out to be a celebration of human spirit, of togetherness in perceivably bad times, as also a moment of catching up. There is a very certain predictability of protests. These then, in one of my essays, I call them as good protesters, the admired modeled ones. This is what Partha Chatterjee, while making a distinction between civil and political society would say is the civil society. It models itself after Western models of civil society and democracy. It sees itself as custodian of democracy. Uh, but then there are other protesters, not so admired ones, not so modeled ones, who do not necessarily always come to or allowed to come to these designated protest sites, or probably they cannot afford to. Those in ghettos, bazaars, by-lanes, these are the despised ones who need disciplining. Their protest could be more organic. It may not necessarily be very, preconceived kind. It might be very organic, also many times very spontaneous as well. It has little tolerance for orchestration, etc. And by its very nature, it could be impulsive as well as chaotic. If we compare the two kinds of protest sites and the inhabitants, they vary hugely. They're class apart. And in real sense, they're class apart. But often there is also a cross-fertility between the two. The poor and the plebeian, Muslims, Dalits, and other oppressed sometimes make inroad into also designated sites and these sanitized spaces so that their voices are heard. Because this is also the places which are frequented by the media people and those who necessarily need to be heard. As they enter these sites, they also try to play the role of the good and the idealized, if that works. Similarly, the civil rights activists, the civil society also at times rushes to sites of, non-designated sites of protests, particularly if there is some sort of violence or huge confrontation between police and the public. It goes and through various means, through fact-finding teams. It would try to furnish the alternate truth and contest the constructs of the state. There are actors, writers, journalists, academics who would popularize the atrocities that the vulnerable bear. But at the same time, it makes its own demands. It makes its own demands, and this was seen very, very visibly there in the Shaheen Bagh and everywhere else. That as the civil society tried to co-opt the protests of the ordinary, it also demanded or expected that it falls in line, that it, behaves, responds, and acts. It loses, that it gives up its organicness, that it adopts the well laid down rules and procedures of the game. So direct confrontation with the state authorities is frowned upon. Language of protest too is supposed to be, extremely contained. There's an idea of a, particularly from the secular civil society, the idea of secularness, certain idea of the secular. And therefore, as they enter these new spaces, they not only, try to be part of it, but at the same time, make demands on it. When it comes to Muslims, these undesignated spaces of protest also carry an extra burden. This extra burden is in terms of how largely the Muslim question is seen in the context of its relationship with nationalism. So these are portrayed as dens of petty criminals, hardened terrorists, religious bigots who inflame masses and unruly mobs. The sobriquet mini Pakistan is very frequently used to denationalize the residents of these ghettos. The edges of these localities are usually termed borders, mimicking the Indo-Pakistan boundary. So you have such places in Mumbai, in Mumbai, Juhapura, and Ahmedabad, JamiaNagar in Delhi, Silampur, etc. Similarly in Ranchi, in many places. In fact, these were the places which during the anti-CAA movement, who emerged as new alternate sites of protest. This kind of prejudicial mapping of the residential spaces is followed by a criminalization of the inhabitants who live there. The state then crushes every act of defiance, small or big, passive or belligerent, with its might. It is not the form and style of protest, but protest per se that is pronounced as anathema to the maintenance of public order. So frequent, deployment, so frequent promulgation of curfews, Section 144, detentions, framing of leaders and activists under various sections of the Indian Penal Code. This is a very familiar story. And if the defiance still stays strong, the extraordinary measures in store. In Mangalore, for example, during the anti-CAA protests, the police tear gassed a Muslim-run hospital I mentioned earlier, where the injured had taken refuge. Similarly, in Western UP, in many places, they vandalized homes. And this time, they particularly targeted the affluent so as to set an example for others that no one is safe. Sometime back in 2013, the Director Generals of Police of 3 states, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu, were asked to submit a report by the central government about the perception of the police in the Muslim community. And the report actually highlighted that there was an amount of distrust. It concluded that there was a chasm or a gap between the Muslims and the police, where the Muslims saw police as biased, communal, etc. While this report actually found such a perception perception unfounded, that it had no basis. But we know that there is a long history. Beginning from the Madan Commission, if we go back to after the Jabalpur riots in 1970s, the Bhiwandi riots in 1970, or a series of mass violence, targeted violence against Muslims. In all such cases, it is the role of the police which has come into a cloud of suspicion. In the Sri Krishna Commission, for example, which investigated the 1992-93 Mumbai riots, they found the police actually nursing an inherent bias against the Muslims. Justice Krishna in his report actually notes it down, that there was a perceptible bias against Muslims in the Maharashtra police. And this is what resulted in brazen violence and active connivance with the Hindu rioters. The question which we have today is one which for me, I don't know, I don't really have a very clear answer to it. But probably a matter of further research and investigation. And this is the question: what is it that brings so much of hatred against the Muslims, which today now we see is present not only amongst the, you would say, those who are uninformed, but intrinsically present amongst those who are considered to be informed, that certain questions about Muslims. The kind of a stigmatization which is taking place appears as having run through across all sections of the population. And this is a situation in which therefore we need to ask a question: what is the reason for this hatred? In the case of Nazi Germany, there are a variety of reasons people attribute as to why Hitler hated the Jews. There are personal reasons as well as there are reasons which are circumstantial. For instance, some people have argued that how Hitler, who was a recruit, who was recruited into the German army during the First World War, and Germany faced a humiliating defeat. We know the difficult conditions which were imposed against Germany. The reason for this defeat was always attributed, the way in which the scapegoats are looked for. So the Jews and the communists were made the scapegoats. And Hitler probably internalized that, was deeply affected by Germany's loss. And he had to attribute it to someone or the other. The Jews came handy. There are other kind of personal reasons which people have cited. For instance, some would say that there is a sort of a self-loathing in Hitler, that part of his family, part of his inheritance was Jewish, and he remained ashamed of it. But the fact of the matter is that anti-Semitism prevailed in Europe and has had a long history running into hundreds of years, at least from the Middle Ages onwards, which was so deep-seated that it could be, actually result in anti-Jewish pogroms in many parts of Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and Russia. Another reason which is attributed for the hatred against the Jews was that the Jews were into banking and commerce. And they were therefore seen as those who not only were prosperous, but also probably those who had accumulated wealth. In the case of Muslims in India, in fact, a majority of the Muslims today remain poor. Although, if we see the data, there is a section of the Muslims which has joined the middle class. And probably that was also reflected in the kind of protests which emerged across the country. But at the same time, this middle class is weak amongst Muslims. If we look at the statistics, the middle class amongst Muslims is, the Muslims fill largely the ranks of the lower middle class, which is, a class category which is an extremely precarious kind of a situation in which it lives. In a bad financial year, it could actually go back into the lower income group. So it is not necessarily very prosperous. In terms of its economic strength, it actually, at least in North India, many parts of North India, in terms of its economic capacity, it is really a sort of a situation in which probably the Jews were. If we say partition, many times partition and the formation of Pakistan is considered as one of the reasons for this continuous, this sort of a emergence of a Muslim other in the Hindu nationalist consciousness. But the fact of the matter is the origins of the Hindu nationalist consciousness goes back to the 19th century, in the early reformers itself. The threat of the Muslim other is present in many of their writings. I don't need to name them right now, but one could see in, say, for example, in Anand Math or Dayanand Saraswati's writings. So the question remains as to how do we then understand this and explain it. As I said, that this is a question which continues to bother me, but at the same time, there is no definite answer. Coming back to the question of protests and the anti-CAA protests, what we saw in the anti-CAA protests was the emergence of a new Muslim public. This new Muslim public was no more, it was, as I said, it has emerged without necessarily any state patronage. It is a new Muslim. It is self-conscious, and therefore we could see both. And therefore it also demands its presence in the public domain on terms of equality and recognition. The old feudal ideas of morality, honor now have been actually replaced by the question of dignity and self-respect. So therefore we will see that veil and hijab wearing women transgress the confines of home to enter public spaces. Colleges, universities, banks, and bazaars, they frequent. Similarly, the skull cap wearing men as well. There are also many, both men and women, who do not wish to be typecast. So this new Muslim now is not burdened by the guilt of partition, which an earlier generation of Muslims were. Or neither is subdued by the politics of being a minority. From the civil society, quote unquote, it actually seeks solidarity, and it is not looking for saviors. I'll stop my discussion. I think it went on for a bit long. And then I'm here open to questions. I don't know. The organizer, if any of you.
Yeah. I'm here. Thank you, Professor Tanweer, for a very wonderful and insightful lecture. Here, the floor is open for more queries and questions. Please raise your hands, or you can put it in the chat box here. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you, so then you can raise the questions. I also would like to inform you all that this program is live on Facebook also, and we have a recording of the program so that we can upload it in the YouTube for future references. There is a question which is sent privately to me. It had to be for everyone question, but it has been sent privately to me in the chat. So the question is regarding the new middle class which you talked about among the Muslims. So the question is, what constitute towards the rise of the new middle class? Maybe he's asking about what all the factors uh, did affect the rise of the new middle class among the Muslims. Uh, Maybe it's political or the other sociological questions.
Hello. Well, this new middle class is not the same as the old one, but it has also emerged from, it has its roots in the old middle class, a section of it, but there's a good section of the new middle class actually has come from the occupational groups. Amongst Muslims, you need to know there are various occupational groups which are also called caste groups. So we have, say, the Muslim Safi, who does iron metal work as well as carpentry. You also have, various different kinds of professions, occupations in which Muslims are there. And these particularly of the opening of the market, the enterprising amongst them have been able to, have some amount of benefit from it. There is a general rise of the middle class, which has been noted in terms of as an economic class by the economists, and which this general rise is seen not only amongst Muslims alone, but even in scheduled castes and tribes. But of course, this rise is not the same as the more affluent sections of the society have. So that is why I said that the Muslims actually, even if they have entered the middle class, they actually populate the lower rungs of the middle class, which is a very precarious kind of a class category. In a bad season, it may lose its middle class status and actually drop down to its low income category. I'm talking about simply economic categories here. So the root of this middle class is not like the earlier one, which was largely dependent on government employment. This is apart from the government employment. I know. Well, I in this chaotic, so there's a question. Should I read out the question? The question is, when you make a distinction between the chaotic and disciplined protesters, there is an assumption that at least some group of unruly Muslims do exist. In India, Muslims can be chaotic when Muslims can be chaotic when their very existence is disciplined? What I was trying to suggest here is, by drawing this contrast, to say that those who are really deeply affected directly by any measure of the state do not necessarily rely on regimented state controlled means of protest. That protest is meaningless. It is only decorative. But by chaotic, I do not really mean that they're necessarily taking to violence, etc. Because violence has its own price, and every protester makes that calculation. This time, at least in the anti-CAA protests, one can see it with and say it with certain amount of certainty that the amount of violence which was used by the state was disproportional completely, and at times unnecessary, and mostly unnecessary. And therefore, I've constantly mentioned about how police firing, killings, etc. took place. So when these two distinctions I'm trying to bring in, I'm trying to suggest that how protests have to, have to be vociferous enough to make their voice heard, and particularly to a regime which seems to be completely unresponsive. And particularly in the case of Muslims, it also seems to be having a certain amount of, instilled hatred. I hope I was able to clarify that.
Yeah, sure. Any other? Okay. Aftab is having a question. I'm asking him to unmute.
Hello. Thank you so much for the very enlightening speech. My question is regarding the historical origin of CAA and NRC. If you look at some of the post-partition violences, the state role in facilitating them, and even some of the Constitution Assembly debates of giving citizenship to Hindus or any other indigenous religious communities, what they quote unquote indigenous religious communities, even if they are living anywhere else, to keep it open for a future. And also, Indian states attempt to displace Muslims, make them evacuees, send them out, make them homeless most of the time, kicking them out of their homes to refugee camps, and then treating them as lesser than animals, push them to Pakistan or Bangladesh, and then preventing them from coming back through other legal measures like permit systems and many other legal instruments. So don't you think that CAA and NRC basically they could not do it mainly on the Bangladesh border or the East Bengal border at that time? So they somehow failed because they had to keep that border for some other economic and other reasons. So is it not a continuation of that project to make many of the Muslims stateless or expel them out of India, and also keep India a place of Hindus mainly, those who reside anywhere in the world? So is it not a continuation rather than a new event in the Indian history?
I will not say a continuation, because what you're referring to is the period immediately after partition, when evacuees property, etc., enemy property, then all those classifications of who is a refugee, who was an evacuee, etc., is sprung up. I think you have read Wazira Zavindar's work. That was immediately in the period around partition, which was a period of turmoil as well. And the contestation within the Congress, as well as in the Indian nationalist politics has always been between these two divergent views. That is one which would like to make India an exclusive, kind of a abode for the Hindus, or I would say Indic in some ways, and those who did not necessarily subscribe to this kind of an idea. Definitely, when you're referring to Constituent Assembly debate, you would also read the interventions of Jawaharlal Nehru as well as Ambedkar, who refused to buy this argument, although this idea was introduced in the debate, but that idea did not have its victory there. It failed to make a law in accordance with that kind of an idea, which is now being done in today. So I would say to a certain extent, the idea has been present, but it could not succeed in 70 years back because of prevailing situation, also probably in the way in which Indian national movement emerged, and the whole legitimacy of that national movement. Although the right-wing tendencies were there, but in the early years, they were contained. This kind of a thing which is happening and which we are witness to today is not what has happened earlier, which we need to make analytical separation to really understand this. This is that is why I'm constantly comparing it with the fascist doctrine. This is the only doctrine which actually has emerged, and in terms of its also theorization, which fashions itself after the idea, mechanism, etc. of the fascist Germany. So that distinction which we need to maintain, while being aware about the fact that the presence of such an idea has always been there. There has been a contestation, sometimes small victories they might have had, but largely, when we see the Citizenship Act of 1955, it does not make any distinction on the basis of religion. The First Amendment takes place under the pressure of the Assam movement. That's a different story. We can talk about it later.
Any further questions? Okay, I think this would be the end of it. If there is any further questions, I would direct you to Professor Tanweer Fazal towards his email or any other platforms, inshallah.
Don't expect an immediate reply. Okay, but yeah, one can. Yeah, this is just an initiation of a sort of a idea, which many people like me thinking around it. Many of you. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah. So, very thank you. There is a question which came again. Do I have to read it out? I'll just put it in the MG1. Okay. This is. Should I read it out?
I read it. Yeah. That whether this cultural nationalism can be overcome by language-based movements. Well, what the cultural nationalism actually is based on, basically the Hindutva idea which we are talking about, is actually basically a thesis, a doctrine, which is trying to find a reason or roots of Indian nationhood as a homogenized national entity. And in that way, the whole idea about Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan was, something as a monolithic national idea would be something which would be directly in, it was expected would come in confrontation with then the other ideas of nationhood, such as particularly linguistic nationalism, which was, which coexists with the Indian federal system, within the Indian federal system. As of now, we do not see necessarily, and there is a, the way in which Hindutva also has been inventive. So it has co-opted in many places the local contradictions, the particularly the linguistic aspirations in many places, and today it is mainly focused on building an idea of Hindu nationhood on the basis of otherizing all those who are outside of this Hindu nationhood. So through this self versus other kind of a construct, it is the contradictions within the Hindu nationalism, for instance, on the basis of language, etc., it aspires to contain them. All right. So I'm not very sure to what extent linguistic nationalism will be able to counteract against the Hindutva nationalism. We now see that its growth in southern Indian states as well, which many of which were part of the anti-Hindi imposition kind of a mobilization. But today there is a perceptible rise of Hindutva consciousness even in those states. So I'm not really very hopeful there.
Okay, that brings this session to an end. And very much thank you, Professor Tanweer Fazal, for this wonderful and insightful speech. And oh, one more.
I do not know what you mean by the fragility of the movement. Are you trying to say that there was an inherent weakness in the movement itself? Or are we trying to say that this fragility is because of the way in which the state responded to, or other sections of the society responded to this anti-CAA movement? But so long as the question of media is concerned, we know that how this whole idea of the independent media is now a myth. In fact, the public sphere has actually almost been subsumed within this nationalist outburst and eruption. It is today the prime mover of that kind of an ideology. And that is a reason why we see perceptions, conceptualizations of the most atrocious nature come to have a, acceptance in large sections of population. So in a way, you're right that the media, I'm not talking everyone in the media, of course, but the dominant tendency within the media, mass media, which typecasted this anti-CA movement in a particular kind. So this too has been a problem, of course.
Okay, Professor Tanweer, it was a very valuable time of yours which been spent on this topic, and of course, it is in an area or a remembrance of 1 year of the anti-CAA protest. Um, we have been in the protest, and we are still in the protest, and we will continue to resist this autocratic and unconstitutional and very much discriminative act of this parliament. We are not aligning with what the act is trying to do with this country anyway. So thank you very much for
At the same time, it is important to also build solidarities.
Exactly. Yeah. So let us hope that we all come together and we resist this autocratic act and make this a better place to live in. And let us have more and more discussions, inshallah, in the future. Thank you, everyone who have participated in this program and raised questions. Thank you, Professor Tanveer.
Thanks.